What's happening, everyone? I was trying to. Oh, here we go. I'm going to do a countdown so you get comfy. Welcome to Portage County Prohibition. This is a program of the Portage County Historical Society. Glad to have you with me this evening as it's still kind of chilly and spring's trying to figure itself out. This week is the 90th anniversary of the beginning of the end of Prohibition. Yeah, so that's why we're talking about it here this week. Well, people are getting in the door here and getting settled in, and it is a Prohibition talk, but I will not judge you if you have a beverage while you're watching it. In fact, maybe it's the way to go. Here's some announcements about the General Historical Society. We have the Synagogue Museum on Water Street open this weekend from 10 to 3 on Saturday. I'm going to be promoting some of the books that I use that we have, full of great research that help put parts of this talk together tonight. So you can go check those out when we're open this Saturday. And then we also, this is pretty fun, coming up on the 14th of April, we are getting honored with a major award, which is an honor to be recognized by the Portage County Business Council during their Creative Excellence Awards breakfast. We are receiving the Charitable Community Award for Portage County for this year. So that's a huge honor, and we're really excited about that. We don't sell the tickets to that. The Business Council does, so you can go to their website if you're interested in being there to see us get honored and to have some yummy food too. Good breakfast. That's coming up on the 14th of April. And we have our annual meeting coming up on the 19th of April, Wednesday, April 19th, 6:30 at the Portage County Library, downtown Stevens Point. I'm really excited about this because we're doing some 1920 stuff tonight to do with Prohibition. And then we're also going to do more 1920 stuff in a couple weeks here with Flapper Fashion, a special presentation by Dr. Leslie Belay. She's from the State Historical Society. She's a curator of textiles and clothing. And so we're going to be diving deep into women's clothing during the 20s, particularly the flapper fad. So that's coming up, and that's a free talk too, by the way. So hope you can come out, enjoy our annual meeting, and get a really entertaining talk about flapper fashion on April 19th at the Stevens Point branch of the Portage County Public Library. Let's talk about Prohibition, shall we? This is gonna be fun. As it is the 90th anniversary of the kind of the end of Prohibition. There's a couple things that ended Prohibition, and one of them that basically made beer legal again happens 90 years ago on Friday. And I thought about having the talk on that day, but then I realized Friday evenings are not usually evenings, especially Good Fridays, for good talks. So I'm getting you prepared. So on Friday, you know that you're supposed to be celebrating the end of Prohibition from 90 years ago. But it's I thought it'd be fun to put together a talk about what the city was like during Prohibition, Stevens Point in particular, as well as other places in the county too, because it kind of radiated out from Stevens Point, but Stevens Point was the hub of a lot of where this stuff took place. So let's dive into it, shall we? National Prohibition, the roots of this movement, temperance is what it's also referred to, and that just means avoidance of alcohol. But the temperance movement meant as it is, you can stretch that movement all the way back to the early 19th century. So the American Temperance Society was founded in 1826, and that encouraged voluntary abstinence from alcohol. And it influenced a lot of organizations after that. There were a lot of reform movements going on throughout the 1800s because there wasn't really like a government mechanism to deal with things, and they were dealing with some pretty heavy stuff like slavery and the Civil War, and then toward the end of the 19th century, you start to see more of these things after the Civil War start to pop up as like, okay, we got that thing out of the way, now we're going to start to deal with some of the things that we perceive as ills of society. And so there are a lot of organizations after the American Temperance Society which advocated mandatory prohibition on the sale and import of alcoholic beverages. There was a religious component to this, especially among Methodists, which became active in the temperance movement. The evangelical Christians of the time were very ardent temperance supporters, and women were big temperance supporters. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which you see some of their publications right here, or rather, there's a song on the left, and on the right, you see a map of when Prohibition took effect in different places. But the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, was founded in 1873 and was one of the leading advocates of prohibition. And the reason that women were getting involved in this is largely because the irresponsibility of men with alcohol. Men would get intoxicated, domestic violence would ensue, men would spend all of their family's money on booze and gambling. And so it largely arose out of that. Also, saloons were places that women could largely go before Prohibition. And so there was a component to that that women were leading the way to basically free themselves from being reliant on men in some ways here through Prohibition. So after 1900, this era in American history called the Progressive Era starts. And that's when you start to see like food and drug laws start to pop up. There's a lot of what are called muckrakers, which are journalists that like rake up the muck, or like they find the seedy underbelly of society and they bring it to the forefront. Corrupt politicians, things to do with factory safety, labor standards, and calls for prohibition during this era become more strident. It's yet another way to reform society. In many ways, temperance activists were seeking to also get rid of the negative social effects of rapid industrialization. There was just a lot more factory work. More people lived in cities than any other time previously in American history as industrialization had taken place. And saloons and the heavy drinking culture they fostered were associated with immigrants and members of the working class that were seen as detrimental to the values of a so-called Christian society at this point. And a lot of immigrants brought with them drinking culture as part of it. You think about here in Portage County, Germans and Poles. It's a community thing to go to a tavern or saloon or community meeting place, and there's beverages, and it's not something weird or something to be afraid of, but it's something that's part of the culture that was brought with them from Europe. And so the main organization that spearheaded, other than the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was known as the Anti-Saloon League. The head of that was a guy named Wayne Wheeler. So the Anti-Saloon League, with strong support from Protestant Christians, and spearheaded this drive for nationwide prohibition. In fact, you could look at it this way too. The Anti-Saloon League was the most powerful political pressure group in U.S. history. What other organization has ever managed to alter the nation's constitution in such a way, right? So, because the end of this is that they get an amendment, not just a law, but something that has to be ratified by states to go into effect. So the Anti-Saloon League radiated out from their national organization into dry leagues. And Portage County, we had a dry league. The Portage County Dry League was formed in January of 1918. Here's a couple of newspaper clippings that show the headlines from when that happened. And the aim of the Portage County Dry League was to rally support locally for national prohibition. And there were statewide organizations, and kind of like you see other, social change organizations today. When they organized these leagues in 1918, they published in the newspaper their what they resolved at their meeting. And so the reasons they stated in 1918 for prohibition was that alcohol production took away from the war effort. You have to remember World War I, America is just getting involved, and we'll see the end by the end of 1918. But wars in those days took a full mobilization of everybody to contribute to the war effort. So they said alcohol took away from the war effort because alcohol production used a lot of materials. It also handicapped religious and educational work in progress, is what they said. I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but I think they mean you're further from your faith if you're drinking. I think is what they're saying. And interestingly, they tried to appeal to business leaders, saying that alcohol was bad for business, that business and drinking don't mix, which is an interesting way to phrase it, because I don't know if that's what went over well with the business leaders. One of the leaders of the group was named Charles E. Van Heck. He became one of the presidents of the group at one point. And his wife was a member of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I couldn't actually find her name, is in the sexism of the newspapers of the time. She was only ever stated as Mrs. Charles E. Van Heck, which is ridiculous. But she was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And Charles was actually also the superintendent of the Stevens Point Waterworks from the 1920s into the late 1930s. So that doesn't have anything to do with it, but interesting how people's, have different involvement in different things. And after Prohibition gets passed in 1919 and enforced into 1920, the group actually reorganizes. So you see C.E. Van Heck is named president at the meeting Thursday evening of the Portage County Dry League. And so there's a new group, and I don't know exactly what the Portage County Dry Enforcement League meant, because that's what they rebranded as, or became, because now they're not trying to convince people prohibition's good, prohibition's here, so they're enforcing it. And all I can imagine is they are not the types of people that you wanted at your party. That's the only thing. The clip on the right, with this little clip I found in the Stevens Point Journal from 1923, and then it says, authorities have discovered a moonshine plant operating at the Monroe Waterworks. We rely confidently on Charlie Van Heck to prevent anything like that happening here. So again, kind of poking fun at his job, the fact that there's not going to be a still set up at the Stevens Point Waterworks, because Charlie Van Heck is very ardent into the temperance movement. So what is the thing that is enforcing all this? Prohibition gets passed, it gets ratified by the states. And even though the amendment is ratified that, there shall be no sale or consumption of intoxicating liquors, there were actually no enforcement measures in the constitutional amendment. It's not a law, it's an amendment. And so you have to make laws to be able to enforce these things, to get yourself in line with the Constitution. And so in Wisconsin, the legislature passed the Muhlberger Act in 1919, which was named for the state representative who authored it. This guy right here, boo. His name is Charles Muhlberger. He was a state representative from Watertown. And his act was, the act he authored, rather, and that bears his name, was actually somewhat lenient in its definition of what intoxicating liquor meant. Charles Muhlberger put in there that 2.5% alcohol could be sold, because it would take a long time to become intoxicated off of 2.5% alcohol. And so he said that's what it is. But they passed that act 3 months before the national, the Congress passed their national act, which is known as the Volstead Act, which was named after the guy who wrote it, who was a senator from Minnesota. And so the Volstead Act, which became national law and superseded the Muhlberger Act, and went into effect in January of 1920. The Volstead Act defined intoxicating liquor as anything more than 0.5% alcohol. So you're really getting everything out of the drink as much as you can. So it's kind of what non-alcoholic beverages are today. Side note on Charles Muhlberger, he got defeated in the next election. Surprise, surprise. Not very many people happy about him in Wisconsin, because Wisconsin was full of people who really thought drinking was part of their culture. And so, there was this powerful brewing industry, not just in Milwaukee, but throughout the state, that relied on jobs and kept the economic engine of the state going too. So, it really became a flashpoint in Wisconsin, because the population was like, we really don't want to do it. And so, too fast. Even so, the 18th Amendment was ratified. The county bowed to the rule of law. The city actually decided to order bars closed before Prohibition in September of 1917 for a short amount of time during the muster of new draftees headed off to World War I. So they were having a gathering of getting all these troops together downtown and hoping to prevent the temptation of one last drink before the 130 men left for basic training to go into the Great War. A Catholic priest named Father E. Croft Gear, implored the boys to look up at the flag and be clean, leave women and drink alone. I would have to imagine that was not heeded advice from the good father, but that was the first time in Stevens Point that had actually happened. And then 2 years later, on July 1st, 1919, Stevens Point began enforcing the Muhlberger Act, which closed all 27 bars within city limits. I want you to think about that too. 27 bars in city limits in Stevens Point in 1919 is a lot of bars per capita. I don't have the population figure in front of me, but my guess is Stevens Point was somewhere in the 8 to 10,000 people range of population at that point. So that's quite a few. But you know, is what it is. It's not too surprising. So the bars closed, but where this really had a big effect was also on a huge manufacturer and the oldest company in the city, which is the Stevens Point Brewing Company. So the Stevens Point Brewing Company, founded in 1857, they had been owned by various individuals until 1901, when they became officially incorporated as the Stevens Point Brewing Company. And they had to switch their entire business around into producing soda. You see on the left, they made Orange Crush, as well as some variations on that. And what is known as near beer. So malt beverages, not real beer. There was for a time medicinal pharmaceutical licenses for brewing, and Point Brewery was ready to go on those. But after some debate in Congress, they decided to strike down any true medicinal licenses. That's kind of an interesting argument for alcohol. But hard liquor got some exemptions for medicinal use, as well as wine because of the religious use of wine in sacraments in the Catholic Church. So there were some things, the ways you could get alcohol if you really could, but brewing was not going to be one of them. It's really decimated the whole brewing industry. So Point Brewery is limping along until 1924. Well, here's a 1922. This is what's known as a Sanborn map. These are fire insurance maps. So people would go around and they would do these very delicate, intricate drawings of urban areas, basically to evaluate whether or not they were insurable and then sell these places insurance. This is kind of then an aerial view of 1922 Stevens Point Brewery. But you'll see it says soft drink manufacturer right there in the middle. And the brewery, all those parts of the brewery are there today. The pink parts right there, where the top one is, where the bottling department, that's still there, and where it says office in the front is that is the gift shop today. These are all still part of the brewery complex today. But yeah, they were listed not as a brewery but as a soft drink manufacturer. So 1924 comes around, and this guy on the right is named Ludwig Korfmann, and he is a brewery supply salesman from Milwaukee. And so he was familiar with Point Brewing Company, as well as a lot of other breweries, because he went around the state trying to sell brewery supplies and ingredients and all this types of stuff. And so in 1924, he bought Point Brewery and changed the name to Stevens Point Beverage Company, because they weren't really a true brewery at that point. It's hard to see in this ad from Christmas in the late 20s, but they had at the bottom above where it says Stevens Point Beverage Company, that's a whole list of products they make. And so they made a lot of different sodas, carbonated flavored water, and of course near beer, to try to get through Prohibition. And this was a huge risky investment, right? To come in during a time when you can't sell beer legally and buy a brewery. And so the saying goes that Ludwig bet his hat every year that Prohibition would end. And he went through quite a few hats because it didn't end until 1933. But he waited it out. And so, and in doing so, also saved the brewery because a lot of breweries went out of business during Prohibition as well. They marketed a new malt beverage called New Brew, which had to have just tasted horrible. If you can't read what the our advertisement says, it says a malt and hop beverage scientifically brewed, fermented, and aged. And they don't say that they had to also boil out the alcohol. So not too fun. In 1929, the brewery, though, reformulates their non-alcoholic beverage, and they call it Point Special Beverage, which might sound or look familiar, because basically that is still the basis of the recipe today. After Prohibition, they simply changed the word beverage on the label to beer, but the roots of arguably the most favorite beer in Stevens Point is in Prohibition, actually, as a near beer before anybody else tasted it otherwise. So there were stories about Point Brewery forgetting to remove alcohol at times too. You know, sometimes that'll happen. It's a pretty honest mistake. But Point Brewery, I mean, they couldn't sell stuff really to a lot of places, so they had to make this soda, had to make that near beer. And the changes for saloons also came quickly. So in 1921, a law came that basically, so it says in this headline, screens disappear for the sale of drinks over bars is a thing of the past. You could not have any sort of screen in front of your window. I mean, bars are even still today things that sometimes there are windows in front, sometimes you can't even see inside. If you were going to operate as a soda fountain, because that's what saloons became essentially, as places you could get soft drinks legally anyway. Not that that's what all they served. But the law came down that you couldn't block visibility into your establishment, because then you would be fined because you could hide behind that. So not only were any sorts of screens or barriers in front of windows not allowed, but any sort of high-backed booths in bars had to be taken down. Any sort of barriers that people could hide behind and drink were now illegal. So there were big changes going on. This is another one of those Sanborn fire insurance maps. And if you look real closely, this is the public square. This is the southeast corner of it. So in that corner is where it says soft drinks. That's actually where the Elbow Room bar is today. And if you look along 2nd Street, all those places used to be bars because they all say soft drinks on them. Here's another look at the square. This area was called the Devil's Elbow at one time because of the bars that were so prevalent and had such a rowdy reputation. And all of the places on this block, this is the northwest corner of the square. There's no bars there today. And this that was all soft drinks too. This is Taylor's Drugstore. They had a location downtown and then a location on Church Street on the south side. And this is some of their advertisement that they were a druggist who also installed a soda fountain in their store as well. So here's some advertisements they took out in the Stevens Point Journal. This is a view from the early 1930s of downtown, or that's what I'm pretty sure what it is. Somebody's going to correct me based on the cards, but I believe this is the 1930s. And how I know it is because you're looking across from basically the two corners of the maps I just showed you. You're looking across from basically where the Elbow Room is today over toward the other corner. If over to the right would be where Fall Line Outfitters is. In that corner is where Head Case Salon is today. And you'll notice that the building on the end there actually got moved over at one point. But that was the Devil's Elbow, like I said, and that was a very rowdy corner throughout Stevens Point's history. And you'll see that there's only Coca-Cola signs above these establishments. And most of the photos we have of that side of the square have beer signs above the bars. But during Prohibition, what difference did it make, right? So they became vendors of Coca-Cola instead. Now, we have some great resources I mentioned, books that talk about this time in history, because we're going to start talking about what did these saloons actually sell, because it wasn't just soda, let me tell you that. And this book, Echoes of Portage County Past, is a really great book because it's basically what are called oral histories, in that somebody interviewed somebody and they wrote it down. And we like to do those recorded now, but the past, it wasn't always so easy to record these things. So this was done. This got printed in 2001. It was kind of a student project to get a student and community project, I should say, to get some stories of people who've been around a long time written down, so we don't lose that information. And so the person who recorded the story, I'm just going to read a short excerpt for you. The guy's name was Phil Nowicki, and he was interviewing his grandpa, Ray Slowinski. And he says, my grandfather, Ray Slowinski, used to make moonshine, gin, and beer. He sold it to local saloons for money. The local saloons would buy any type of alcohol as long as it was good quality. The saloons would pay about $1 for a gallon of moonshine and more for gin. Beer was cheap back then, only 8 cents a glass. The materials cost a lot to make alcohol, so you only made about a dime per gallon sold. But the thing you had to watch out for was the feds. They would come in all the saloons and smash all the booze in the place. All the saloons in town watched out for each other. When one got busted, they contacted the other saloons in town and told them the feds were in. And then they chipped in on the first saloon's fines if they got any. He says his grandfather always sold his booze to the Meadow Inn, which I could not find where that was, unfortunately, but I'll keep digging. Because they paid higher prices than other saloons in town. One day the feds came into town at night and busted all the saloons in the city. My grandfather was at the Meadow Inn when they came in. They were wearing gray suits and black hats and had axes. They took their axes and smashed just about everything in sight. There was glass and booze all over the place. They then gave the bartender an $80 fine and gave him a warning and told him if he had any more booze on the premises, he would lose his saloon. So, you know, you can kind of get a sense of how that was. His grandpa, he said, would make booze in a large copper kettle over a fire, and then he would sell it to these places. We have another great couple of books that we sell that also contain stories of these bootleggings. One is on the left, you see Portage County Shadows, which has more than just this. That has other stories of debaucherous activity throughout Stevens Point's and the county history. That's a fun one. It has all sorts of things. There's some brothels in there, different violent things, ghost stories, some stuff like that. And then the pamphlet on the right was done as a research project by Sean Shabilsky about the Portage County Liquor Syndicate. And that's what I'm going to tell you about right now. So when the enforcement of these new liquor laws didn't really have an effect on the drinking habits of the county. People kind of ignore them. A lot of places in Wisconsin did. The enforcement of these laws was really hard. And the local authorities were oftentimes in on the bootlegging or on the bootleggers' payroll, so they would look the other way. So according to the clerk of courts, the annual crime statistics reports, in 1923, there were only 7 convictions for violations of the prohibition laws in the county in 1923. Those numbers only dropped. 7's not a lot. 3 were convicted in 1927 and 4 in 1929. So there was virtually no risk for the home brewer or home distiller. Families made their own spirits and sold the surplus to neighbors. And many of the taverns in Stevens Point stayed open, as we said, soda fountains, gathering places, restaurants. And most of this home brewed liquor was available in those establishments. And one of those places was called the Empire Saloon, which was on Main Street, which is where Dive Point Scuba is today. And the Empire was owned by a guy named John Bannock. Bannock could not always get an adequate supply of liquor for his tavern, so he decided to start producing whiskey, and he teamed up with Dan Cluck to set up a still. And so Cluck was the head of the operation. Bannock was the public relations guy, and they brought in a guy named Ed Zinda, who you'll see right there. Ed Zinda ran the day-to-day operations. Thank you to John Zinda and Karen Zinda for sending in the picture of their relative who was in on this bootlegging operation. So they set up production and storage sites, and there was a healthy demand for this product. Orders were coming in faster than they could be filled. On top of that, orders started coming in from Chicago and Minneapolis. And so what became known as the syndicate, a liquor syndicate, expanded quickly. At its peak, they were producing 2,500 300 gallons of liquor every day. That is a crazy amount. And the liquor cost 75 cents to make because they're making so much. And they sold it for $2.25 so for a gallon. So they were making quite the profits. It wasn't like the mob, though. They felt very safe operating in Portage County. They had a lot of arrangements with local officials. They didn't have much trouble with the law, and so they didn't need to travel around armed. But big city mobsters came to Stevens Point. They would try to hijack the operation, and the storage sites were where they could find the easiest targets. So the syndicate would lease out barns and basements from people all over the county to store their materials and their product. And people were happy to make a few extra dollars, especially as the Great Depression sets in the late 20s and early 30s. And so they would store these things, and the hijackers would storm the home and tie up the owner and take everything and leave. They were also hijackings of shipments where gunmen would set up roadblocks. Again, this is in Portage County and throughout Wisconsin, roads you travel on today. So they set up roadblocks, and then they would wait with shotguns and submachine guns and hijack the shipment. Even Bannock, who was the head of this operation, was hijacked it as well. Only one driver that we know of was killed in a hijacking. A guy was driving back to his hometown in Minnesota with his shipment of liquor and was forced off the road and shot. That's the only known casualty of this whole operation. And the Wisconsin Treasury Department, and I'm just going to go ahead to this next slide. This is a Mill Creek. This is some foreshadowing here. The Wisconsin Treasury Department didn't have the resources to enforce the law. There were simply too many stills, speakeasies to give much attention to rural operations, and local officials were mostly paid off by the syndicate. So despite the annoyance of the hijackings, the syndicate operated pretty smoothly. And then comes the end of Prohibition. By the end of Prohibition, alcohol consumption in Portage County was just as if not more prevalent than pre-1920s levels. And I'm not going to tell you everything that happens to the liquor syndicate, but you should know that they didn't stop when Prohibition ended, which was their mistake, because they were producing stuff that they weren't then paying taxes on. So they got in a whole different kind of trouble. And we tell the story of the liquor syndicate on our historic pub crawl tours. And we're going to be announcing our dates for those tours and locations here in the next couple weeks. So stay tuned to our social media. If you're a member, you'll find out about those things first. Another reason to become a member. But Mill Creek plays a role in all that. So there's a historic picture of Mill Creek. So what happens next? Well, Prohibition is going to end, which is good for businesses like Point Brewery. So here's a photograph of Point Brewery in 1931, and it's kind of a sad-looking state, isn't it? Looks a little different than today. Looks not very cared for, and that has to do with the fact that they only had 4 employees left on the payroll by 1931. They were really struggling. They had outsourced all of their near beer production to another place so that they could just concentrate on making soda. But yeah, they basically had Ludwig Korfmann, the brewmaster, who was George Egenhofer. Around in 1931, a guy comes on who's their accountant named Phil Shabilsky, who really is instrumental in seeing the brewery through the next phases of its existence. And then they have another helper, maintenance person. So you have 4 people, and I guarantee you Phil Shabilsky wasn't just doing accounting. He was probably wearing many hats at that point. But they're on their way to closing, essentially. You don't have a lot of people left. You can't make that much product. There's not that much demand because there's only so much soda people are going to drink, right? And so what happens is in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, and the campaign promise that he makes, because the Great Depression is raging on, is that he's going to, one of his first things he's going to do is legalize alcohol. And so, or at least modify the laws through executive order. And so he takes office in March, and in his first week in office, he signs the executive order that legalizes the sale of 3.2% alcohol beer. So you're not full strength beer, but it's real beer, right? And the day that it goes into effect to be able to drink 3.2% alcohol beer is April 7th, 1933. So 2 days from now will be the 90th anniversary of that beer becoming legal again. And so it's actually known as National Beer Day because of that. And so what happened at Point Brewery, because here you see a photograph of the guy on the left is Ludwig Korfmann, and the guy on the right is the brewmaster named George Egenhofer, who I really feel for because he came over to America from Germany in 1912, and 8 years later, he can't even make beer anymore. And this is the guy who's, born and bred on this stuff. And so what they do at midnight moving into April 7th, there's a line around the block at Point Brewery. And Korfmann and Egenhofer go to the freight elevator at Point Brewery, which you can still go to today and see. And they inside the freight elevator is a rope you pull to make the steam whistle blow. The steam whistle traditionally was just used to signal shift change, but they blew that rope many times at midnight, and then on the hour for the entire next day to celebrate that Prohibition had ended. The line stretched around the block, like I said, at Point Brewery. The first guy to get legal beer for the first time in 13 years was a gentleman from Custer, who stood in line all day and picked up 2 bottles of beer. That was it. That's all he wanted. So he picks up his beer, and the second person in line is an agent for the Congress Club bar, which is still around. And the Congress Club becomes the first bar to tap Real Point Special and the first beer after Prohibition at 12:11 a.m. And so this is a picture a little later from that, but I think it's safe to say they were pretty happy at Point Brewery. But the demand for beer kept up for a while. They had a line around the block for basically the next week. And kept up with production pretty well, because to make near beer, you have to make real beer first. So they still had the product and all that. But Prohibition was over it, and the bars of Stevens Point and Portage County were open again, and Point Brewery is back in business. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that women were part of the activism. Women's activism was part of the reason Prohibition took place in the first place. And women were actually just as active in anti-prohibition activities as well. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform led the drive for repeal. The organization framed its campaign in moral terms, arguing that the effects of prohibition, which gave rise to an entire criminal class, corruption of public officials, and widespread disrespect for the rule of law, represented serious threat to American homes and values. And the other thing that helped get rid of prohibition was the Great Depression. So given the dire economic situation of the country, the federal government could not forego the tax revenues that the production and consumption of alcoholic beverages would bring on. So I mentioned that April 7th, 1933 is when Prohibition was altered, right? FDR made it so you could buy 3.2% alcohol beer. That didn't go away with all of Prohibition, though, right? You still couldn't produce hard liquor or anything like that, and you couldn't certainly produce a full strength, 5 to 6% alcohol beer at that point. And so, because the laws had come about through a constitutional amendment had to come along to get rid of it. So the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, and that was ratified on December 5th, 1933. So mark your calendars for December 5th, because it's another time that you can enjoy yourself and celebrate a 90th anniversary, which ended the nation's ban on the manufacture and distribution of alcohol. Prohibition was a unique social experience that is pretty crazy that was actually allowed to happen, if I got to be honest. But it caused all these things like criminal activity and a disregard for the rule of law. It really altered American history in that way too. So this is from December, this newspaper clipping here. So Stevens Point, I think it was safe to say, did not have a city ordinance against the consumption of alcohol by the time they got around to December of that year. So there it is. That is the talk for this evening. Does anybody have any questions? I'll give you a second to put some questions together. Bring the first slide back up. I'll say again that we have some of those books for sale. that I mentioned. So the Portage County Shadows, Echoes of Portage County Past, and the Portage County Liquor Syndicate. You could at the Beth Israel Synagogue Museum this weekend on Saturday between 10 and 3. And as well as you can see where they actually pulled the rope to blow the steam whistle at Point Brewery. We'll be announcing by the end of the week. So the next 2 days, we'll be announcing our dates for the Portage County, or excuse me, the Point Brewery History Tours, if I can say it correctly, which I lead. And those are a ton of fun. That is not your average Point Brewery tour. That is a hour deep dive into the history of the brewery, including the era of Prohibition. So thank you to Bruce for chiming in that they enjoyed the talk and the annual meeting. That is a good thing to bring up here. Let me show you the graphic for the annual meeting in case you missed it at the beginning. That's coming up on Wednesday, April 19th at the Portage County Library. It's all about flapper fashion with Dr. Leslie Belay from the State Historical Society. And that's free. So just show up, learn a little bit about Portage County Historical Society, and enjoy the talk as well. I see a lot of messages of thanks, which I always appreciate. If you're not a member already, make sure that you become a member so that we can keep talks like this going. We'll see you again soon. All right. Have a good night, everybody. And if you haven't cracked a beverage, I'm giving you permission to do so right now. All right. Take it easy.